Greetings, everybody. Welcome to the 14th episode of my Banker Education Series webinar show. This is Eric Cook. It is June 23rd, 2016, and I am very excited to have you with me with my guest, Mr. Lee Wetherington. As you may have seen from the bio and the intro that I provided on the website, I'm a big fan of Lee's, and those of you that have had the pleasure of hearing him or seeing him or experiencing him, I guess would maybe even be a better word, at a conference or convention, know you're in for a real treat. This guy is a super entertaining presenter, a wildly educated individual on all things banking related, and during the prep of this, we talked about a bazillion different things, and my hope is this is just the first of what will be many more appearances in the Banker Education Series sessions, because he's got a lot more information to share for our banking audience. So I am super excited. Before we officially get rolling, I just want to cover a couple of housekeeping items. I am here at the Banker Education Series page. Depending on how you heard about today's show, because we posted it and promoted it a bunch of different ways, if you would like to get email reminders for future shows that are coming up, you can see there's a link right there in the opening paragraph where you can sign up for those reminders. We do monthly shows on all topics related to banking and financial services. And as you can see, this is the 14th episode, so we've got 13 others that you can browse. And links to all of past shows are provided on this Banker Education Series page. So please feel free to browse around, sign up for the reminders, and share with colleagues and friends. We'd love to get the word out and have you join us every month. I also want to encourage you to ask questions and provide feedback during today's show. That's one of the joys of doing a live webinar, although sometimes we step on our tongues and make a little mistake here or there, but it is a live show. We do want to hear from you as audience members, so you can use the chat functionality on your control panel and send us your feedback and interaction, and we'll be certainly happy to answer that as we roll along. So before we get started, and Lee doesn't even know that I'm going to do this, I wanted to share a picture, and I debated about sharing a picture that was one of the first pictures that actually brought me kind of to familiarity with Lee when I was chairing the Ops and Tech Committee for the Michigan Bankers Association way back in the day. He shared a photo of a white-tailed doorbell, and I'm not going to put that up on the screen because I'll let you Google for that. But I still have people here in Michigan that tease me that actually is my doorbell. So I want to thank you for that, Lee, because that's one of your living legacies and kind of creativity that I love about you. But
my pleasure.
I thought it was interesting. Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was interesting given the fact that we're talking about payments and some of the evolutionary components around them and why they're still not where they want to be. Just yesterday, I had to run to the grocery store to pick up a couple of things. And even though the chip has been out, merchants are supposed to be using it. It's supposed to be protecting us and making transactions more secure. I don't know about you, but maybe 20% of the merchants that I go to are even supporting it. And this was a store that actually kind of jerry-rigged a little kind of, swipe your card. We're not supporting the chip yet. And, so there is somewhat of a disjointed payments environment here that we're experiencing in the world of banking. And it's creating some confusion with folks. And that's why I'm so excited. Lee's going to be here and talk about why Starbucks rocks and EMV might suck a little bit. So with that, I'm going to work my magic with GoToWebinar, and I'm going to send the controls over to Lee so he can share his screen. But once again, I would very much like to welcome you, and if I had canned applause, I would cue it right now. My good friend, Mr. Lee Wetherington, to the show, and that is an awesome picture, I must say. I referred to it a different way in the pre-show, but I'm going to keep it family. But you look like you really know what you're talking about there, mister.
I've got to do whatever I can visually to give myself gravitas that I don't earn. Eric, thank you for that very kind and generous introduction. Eric is a longtime friend. I find him fascinating for several reasons, not the least of which is that the guy was a banker who suddenly became sort of the nation's preeminent expert in the nexus of social media and financial services. And so it's certainly an honor to be on today's webinar. And I'm really excited to have a platform to discuss payments in kind of a free-form way. I put the presentation together literally just here in the last few hours, cherry-picking some of the stuff that I think is most interesting going on in this space, and the things that I think also that most bankers are not aware of. So I use those two criteria to kind of shape what we're going to do. So we're going to talk about payments. We're going to talk about where we are, and we're going to talk about where we're headed. So we're going to go through some visuals here. We'll stop intermittently for some banter and to take some questions if we have them come in. But we're going to start by talking about where we are. And where we are is, of course, exactly what Eric visualized for us in the intro. We've actually taken a step backwards in the quality of user experience associated with payments as most people experience them, and that is payments at the point of sale. And we've taken that step back because we as a country are the last to come onto a global standard called EMV to help combat what was a growing tide of counterfeit card fraud on the shoulders of breaches that we've been reading about for years, et cetera. The problem is that because we're the last to come on, because EMV is a 20-year-old technology, and there are better, safer, faster, certainly more enjoyable ways to do card payments these days, we have to do this to get us to the next step. And I'm hoping we're going to leapfrog to the next thing, and we'll be talking about the next thing. But I've got some comments specifically about what our current pain points at the POS mean for issuers, what it means for banks who are issuing both credit cards and debit cards, and we'll talk about that. It's also important to understand how we've responded to this shift as we shift away from the fraud that we've been seeing in terms of counterfeit card fraud, and as EMV begins to bring those numbers down. Of course, this is whack-a-mole, so the hackers and the fraudsters are taking their fight in other arenas, and more specifically the card not present arena, or CNP, the acronym if you're a payments person. We see fraud really taking off in those areas, and we knew all of this, by the way, because we have the benefit of the experience of all these other industrialized countries around the world who have adopted EMV and see their, as their card present fraud rates come down, they see their card not present rates explode, and that's what we're in the middle of experiencing now. The thing that most of us don't understand about that, we'll unpack it more as we get into the webinar, is our response to that shift in fraud is devastating for some issuers, their card franchise, in ways that many don't even quite exactly understand that it's devastating them. And I want to make sure that everybody on this call at least understands that dynamic and can do what you can to mitigate it. Once we've talked about where we are, we're going to go take a look into the future. Payments very soon here are going to speed up. They're already disappearing. If you're a payments guru, you use the $10 word sublimation to talk about the disappearance of physical instances of payments. This is where payments happen automatically, typically in the background, sometimes mediated by way of an app that connects the payer and the payee, and we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about more broadly the shift from what is being coined as contextual commerce 2.0 to a place that will end up in about probably 4 to 5 years, in a place that will certainly be more advantageous to issuers, and that will be contextual commerce 3.0. It's important to understand the difference between those two things, and there's some good news behind that, and I want to share that as well. I can't talk about payments without somebody eventually asking about Bitcoin or blockchain, what the difference is, whether it matters, whether to believe or to be scared of all of the headlines that we see in the trades on a daily basis about blockchain, disrupting everything, not just payments, by the way, but sort of wholesale the way value is exchanged, not just in the United States, but worldwide. So I need to bring a little bit of sobriety to that, and also give you some more definitive and concrete timelines about when blockchain will actually matter, why it will matter, and the conditions that must be satisfied before it actually impacts the average bank in the United States? So many don't really know the answers to those questions, and so that's another thing that we're going to cover before we're done. At the very end, if we have time, I also want to get on a soapbox and talk to you about why I think user experience, or UX for short, is so very important, not just in banking in general, but in payments in particular. And I want to introduce a new concept that at least I'm calling the via negativa. This is the way of subtraction. If you look at the most innovative things going on in the fintech space, the most innovative things going on in bank technology, financial services technology, you will see that the most compelling of those innovations are ones that actually take things away. They don't add things. It's not a, we're in a very, very long and bad habit in our industry of thinking that our salvation or the soundness of our business model hinges upon adding the next 2 or 3 features and functions that will make our mobile banking sexier, or our online banking sexier, or our payments sexier. And that's not it. Really, it's about taking away those things that aren't relevant anymore to give enough room to declutter, if you will, to simplify enough to be able to create a coherent end user experience of these different services that we offer. And it's only if you can offer a coherent experience that you can hope to get to a good experience, or a good UX, if you will. So that's our outline, and we're going to go at a relatively quick clip. Like I said, every once in a while I will pause, ask for Eric's input, and see if we have any questions coming in. So in terms of where we are, right now we're all fiercely focused on the point of sale, at shipping our cards, at getting them deployed. Of course, because of Durbin, we had more hoops to jump through to get our debit cards deployed, chipped and deployed consistent with not just the EMV standards, but the routing standards mandated by the Durbin Amendment. But and we're all experiencing that now. So this is a great place to start our presentation. And by the way, this is why the phrase EMV sucks made its way to the title of the presentation. If you think about what sucks most right now about the point of sale, it's the eternity that we're all waiting for that chip card to clear authorization, right? So whereas we have been accustomed for 30 years to be able to swipe and go, we now have to dip and stay. And it feels like an eternity because of the faster way we used to pay with magstripe cards. Not only are we standing there for what seems like an eternity, but many of you probably also enjoy the beautiful sound that happens to let you know you can now finally remove your card from that dip EMV terminal. That it's probably, I don't know that we could have designed the user experience any worse than it is. Maybe if the point of sale terminal actually were able to just poke you, in the gut or something like that at the end of it, it would have been worse. But so we've really taken a step back in terms of user experience, and it's problematic. If you want to think, let's talk comparative payments for a minute. If you will think for a moment about the way you feel when the person ahead of you in line at a point of sale whips out a checkbook, right? That white-hot judgment that you feel and that you project through your eyeballs into the back of the head of the person in front of you when that happens. This is now actually happening when you are in line at a place that accepts Apple Pay or Android Pay or Samsung Pay. When you have an Apple Pay person behind you and you whip out your chip card, they're now giving you the same eye roll that we all have been giving people who continue to take checkbooks to the point of sale. And so it does matter. Comparative payment experiences do matter, and they shape sort of the way things go. Now, just to give you some more specificity here, that EMV, the average EMV dip and stay transaction takes about 9 seconds. Now, Lee, 9 seconds is not an eternity. Why were you dramatic and say that it feels like it feels like an eternity? When you've been able to swipe and go, 9 seconds feels like an eternity. And let me put it into even finer relief for you. This is a study that just came out last year. Our attention spans, because of the mobile devices and the texting and the apps and all of that, the average human attention span has actually narrowed from 12 seconds to 8 seconds. This is official, science-driven, research-driven numbers. 8 seconds. So as I said, the average EMV transaction takes 9 seconds. That's 1 second longer than our attention spans will tolerate. By the way, a goldfish could tolerate an EMV transaction better than we can apparently, because the average goldfish, their attention span lasts a second longer. So we're in a bad spot right now with the way in which most of us experience payments in the most common way we experience payments in the United States. We have other concerns. We have the ongoing sort of fear of the fintech disintermediation, and many of those fintech startup companies that we read so much about, many of them are payments related companies, and we talk about the unbundling of banking, or at least we've been talking about it for the last 3 years. This is where things that folks used to always and only go to banks to get, they're now able to go to secondary providers to obtain, and typically in better, more compelling, faster, efficient, or easier ways. This also applies, of course, to the payment space. We look at those numbers about all the venture capital being poured into fintech firms, and a majority of that, by the way, does typically go, or close to a majority of that funding does go to payments-related fintech companies, and we really worry about that. But would we really say that we're seeing wholesale disruption? I don't think so. If you think about even PayPal, and PayPal is still the 800-pound gorilla and innovator in the payment space, PayPal still has just a very small margin of the payments franchise business in the United States compared to chartered financial institutions. We could think of we have PayPal, of course, also has Venmo. We'll be talking about Starbucks in just a moment. We'll be talking more about the device-based and mobile operating system-based wallets in just a moment. But all of those things together still make up a very, very small part of the payments pie in the United States. So while we see some unbundling at the fringes of our payments franchises, we certainly don't see anything in the way of wholesale disruption. And if we want to think about it on a gradation scale, all of these, what we read so much about when we talk about Apple Pay and Samsung Pay and Android Pay, and I'll give you a little bit more background on where we are with those here in just a moment. All of those have served so far to reinforce our card franchises as issuers. They have not come up with a third payment rail and disintermediated banks from their payment franchises in any kind of elemental or fundamental way. Just the opposite. They've reinforced the importance and the centrality of the card franchise. In fact, let me say, I'll add one more thing here. We were really afraid about, or at least 3 years ago when it was first announced, we were afraid what the big box stores were going to do in the way of making good on their threat to come up with a non-card payment alternative that would become predominant in the big box retail space. That was called the MCX, or Merchant Customer Exchange Consortium. They were going to come out with their own mobile payments rail and app called Currency. By the way, it never came out. And MCX right now, as we know from just the headlines in the last few weeks, MCX is imploding. It is going away. They laid off most of their staff. They were never able to get that third rail up. And guess what? Payments are hard. And the funny thing about payments is it's a chicken and egg thing. You have to have ubiquity to get any traction. To get any traction, you got to have ubiquity. It's a difficult thing to crack into. And the good thing for you is that as an issuer, you have a virtually protected franchise. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't threats, and there doesn't mean that you won't see some erosion of the direct control of your payments franchise going forward. But we've not seen anything in the way of classic technical disruption in payments. We've seen a little bit more displacement in merchant services, what PayPal offers to small businesses and particularly online businesses to be able to not just accept payments, but they've moved out into small business financing, into inventory management, and you see that with Square, you see that with Shopkick, etc. And if you want to look a little further out, if we look at the international payments front, there's probably more opportunity for something approaching disruption there than in any of these other payment categories. But we've not seen wholesale disruption in payments. It's been, I would tell you and submit to you, overstated. So what's the big deal with everything we have been seeing going on in fintech, especially as it relates to payments? What are the threats to banks? Well, there are material threats there. We see at the peripheries of our customers who keep their primary checking accounts with us, but pick up other products and services, typically more profitable products and services from secondary financial institution relationships, or in some cases, fintech providers. The bottom line there is that they do kind of go after or target the most profitable segments of customers, the high income customers, the younger customers, the Gen Y, Gen 2, the millennial segment, small businesses. So yeah, we've seen some displacement there. Nothing, like I said, in the way of wholesale disruption. We worry a lot about, and we should worry about, the bank being reduced to a passive funding source in a lot of these third-party mobile wallet initiatives like Apple Pay and Samsung Pay and Android Pay. Because even if you are the top of wallet or the default card on file for Apple Pay, your brand is really sort of put an arm's length back into the background. When someone does an Apple Pay transaction, they're not thinking, I just use my bank's debit card. They're thinking, I just use my phone to make or to buy something by way of Apple. So we do have to worry about those things, and we'll talk more about those that particular space here more directly in just a moment. The thing that really keeps us up at night, though, is our complete disintermediation as a bank. And I would tell you, though, the good news, again, to get back to MCX's demise here just in the last couple of months, is that we've not seen anybody successfully do that or even approach that in the payment space. There are things to be concerned about with mobile order ahead and pace mechanisms like Starbucks. We'll talk about that in just a minute. There are reasons to worry about what the trend toward buy online and pick up in store means for us. But again, these are not wholesale disruption. These are shifts sort of in the power posture, if you will, of different players, established players in the existing payment chain. Before we move on and get into the sort of meat and potatoes of the different areas of payments and what's going to happen to those areas as we move forward, I want to give you one helpful tip about how to think about fintechs. If you think about fintechs in the following way, I can promise you, first of all, you'll have a lot less fear, and secondarily, you'll have a much more realistic perception of where there's not just challenge, but more to the point where there's opportunity. And that is to classify them by their attitude toward you, toward banks. If you think about fintechs, you will find that most of them, actually a majority of them, are looking for some way to partner with or to outright serve the established banking industry, chartered banks. All right, there's only a small handful that are trying to become a bank or trying to become a chartered financial institution to go after you one-on-one. Most of the fintechs, especially the payments fintechs are a great example of this, do not offer full stack financial services. They don't, and they never will, and they're not interested in doing that. They take very small, narrow pieces of the payments chain or the financial services chain, and they re-engineer them in new ways to make them faster, better, simpler. But then, of course, the venture capital that has been poured into these fintechs must be repaid at some point. And the only way to repay is by getting to a business model that produces revenue. And the only way to do that for most fintechs is to license what they have to established banks, to be acquired by a bank so that the venture capitalist gets a payoff, or to partner in some way with a network of banks and to offer that new innovation or that new narrow piece of technology to established players. That's the way the ecosystem has always worked. That's the way it still continues to function and work today. All right. So the bottom line there is that banks and fintechs need each other. So if you've been succumbing to this hype cycle of fintechs are going to come and they're going to kill all banks and fintechs will be the way of the future, it's not like that. Banks need fintech. Fintech need banks. And by the way, fintechs need banks specifically for the payments expertise that banks have, for your ability not just to originate, receive, and settle payments, but to manage the credit risk, the operational risk, and all those other things that have taken a long time to master, to automate, and to mitigate. So just please keep that in mind as you hear more and more about fintechs, especially as they innovate in the payment space. So I would tell all of you, don't be scared of fintechs, be inspired by fintechs. There are things that we need from them and that we can learn from them. They do personal financial management capabilities better than most banks do. They're leading edge when it comes to humanizing digital support and providing quote-unquote assistant in the app type capabilities. They're very good at contextualizing experiences based on where you are and what's actually at risk. They're very good at that. And probably better than anything, they're really, really good at creating good user experience. And that's where we can learn a lot as banks in taking our customers from neutral or negative money emotions to very positive money emotions. Okay, here's the good news. The good news is that, by the way, Eric didn't mention this in his introduction, but my job at Jack Henry is I'm a meta-analyst when it comes down to it. So I'm the guy who analyzes the analysts who analyze our industry. Now that sounds really complicated, but all that means is that I'm digesting all of the research produced by the analysts that track our industry, and I'm looking for consensus, I'm looking for points of agreement and disagreement, I'm looking for patterns of groupthink, and I'm trying to take all of that and distill it into, meaningful, actionable kind of insight for where we're headed. One of the things I can tell you based on that research that comes across my desk is that all of the major analysts in our industry have designated 2016 as the inauguration of the rebundling of banking. That is, all of these things that we've been losing at the edges and the peripheries of our business franchise, we're now beginning to see actually come back into a more cohesive bank-centric model. And it's coming to us by way of stronger, better API technologies. Another way of talking about the rebundling of banking is fintegration. You may or may not have seen that phrase being used. But when you see these new, more powerful API platforms like Plaid, like Finicity in the trades, when you begin to see companies like Google with Android Pay specifically, by the way, Android Pay is a mobile payment capability that is baked into the Android mobile operating system and is accessed by a publicly available API that Google publishes to the world, which means, by the way, that issuers like the banks on this call today can incorporate or literally integrate Android Pay mobile payment capability into and inside of the context of your own specific mobile banking app. That is not something that you can do right now in the Apple Pay world, right? Because only Apple has access to the NFC capability of the iPhone. It has not opened that up to other third parties, including banks. So I mentioned this Android Pay example as, again, as a way of showing you, if you begin to look, you will see this thread through a lot of the fintech coverage in our industry, that more and more banks have opportunities to bring in the best of what fintechs innovate by way of APIs and incorporate and integrate them into what you're doing with your digital banking services. If we look to the future, what you will see are, a few different scenarios beginning to play out, and these are not mutually exclusive. Scenario number one is what we're all kind of familiar with, right? You have a legacy banking platform, you put a digital banking interface on top of it, and that's what customers sort of interact with you through to get your banking and payments products and services. Or there are a few banks out there who are, some of them creating a brand new brand identity or even a separate bank charter to build a sort of from the ground up digital bank based on starting with a digital banking platform that is created specifically to facilitate APIs from a lot of different places into a curated, really wonderful user experience and powerful financial services offering from that particular institution. Number three is the distributed bank, right, where you are literally a curator of the best from the fintech world. You're aggregating those together in a way that's meaningful and coherent, produces a good UX, and that's what you're providing to the customers. Scenario number four is that nightmare scenario, right, where suddenly now not only are the fintechs, sort of, you're curating from the fintechs, but the bank becomes just another one of those back-end providers, and some other entity is standing between you, the fintechs, and the customers. So think of a Facebook, for instance. Mark Zuckerberg, I'm sure, would tell you that you don't really need the internet, you just need Facebook. So everything eventually will just go through Facebook. Now, I don't subscribe to that at all. But these are the different scenarios that we hear talked about. And the good news is that if you look at all of them, or I should say, if you look at the most probable scenarios, which are scenarios 1 through 3, the bank really still factors centrally in all of those scenarios. But the question is, how does that look? How does that look going forward? How does it happen? I don't think there's a better way to say it than the way Ron Shevlin, my friend Ron at Cornerstone, says it. And he said this recently. What banks need to create to manage all of these interstitial APIs through which you can access the best of the best are platforms that make that access easy, not partnerships. If each of us on this call actually have to go out and negotiate individual, both operational, technical, and business partnerships with every single fintech that we want to work with or incorporate innovation from, that's not tenable for the average bank. So that's why we need platforms. Instead of negotiating these relationships one-to-one, we need platforms that facilitate the negotiation of those relationships one-to-many. And you see that right now. You see that in my world, we call that the Banno platform. And Jack Henry is exactly what we launched last year. We've had J Exchange for a while. We do Power-Ons, et cetera. All of those are different platforms for giving banks more flexibility to tie in everything they want to tie in a flexible way. Fiserv, and Fiserv, they call it Enterprise Services Framework. If you look outside the established sort of FinServ ecosystem, you've got providers like Backbase and D3 that, in essence, kind of go at it in the same way, but from outside of the core platform. Even BBVA, one of the biggest banks in the world, they've now launched their own API, open API platform to make it easier for businesses and others to take advantage directly of BBVA's payment capabilities and other banking services. So this is a thread that you will see, and it absolutely ties into what's going on in payments. We gave an example of Android Pay. There are many, many others. So let's talk about payments in a very quick, broad stroke in terms of where we are and what's coming up next. What you see in front of you now are two charts. On the left is where we've been. This is from Nielsen, and this shows you from 2009 roughly to 2014 what's happened to our different payments franchises. So over that 5-year time frame, you've got debit card volume up 54%, electronic payment volume up 45%, credit card volume up 27%. And then on the downside and the declines, you see cash and you see checks, 5% down, 36% down respectively. That shouldn't surprise anybody on the call. What you should take away from that is what we already know, which is our card franchises are still growing. They're still central. They're still the most important part for most of you of your non-interest fee income component, right? If we look at the right side, the charts on the right side, that's taking a look forward on through beyond 2014 through the numbers that we have in definitively, on through projected through to 2019. And at the top on the right, you see that is dollar volume of payments per payment type. On the bottom, that is transaction volume per payment type. And so if we look at those, you see, again, in terms of dollar volume, credit cards are where it's at. If you, as a bank, got out of credit card issuing, I'm going to tell you right now, you should be looking to get back into it. And the reasons for that are not just that credit cards are growing from a dollar standpoint and are projected to continue to do so very vibrantly through 2019, but a lot of these card-on-file systems default to credit cards more often than debit cards. So obviously, if your bank doesn't offer a credit card, only offers a debit card, you may be diminishing your chances of being the top of wallet card for these card-on-file systems, whether it's iTunes, Starbucks, Uber, whatever the case may be. Okay?
Hey, Lee?
Yes.
Yeah, quick question on that. So a lot of community banks will work with a third-party credit card provider and historically have chosen not to participate in the risk and exposure for that credit card portfolio. They'll just go ahead and get some sort of a referral fee when the card is opened, and then the card provider will basically take all the interchange, but they also know that if there's a loss, the bank's not obligated to participate in any of that. Should that decision be revisited for those? Because I know my community bank participates with Elan, for example. And I think when I was there, we launched the program, and it was very much, you get a fee for getting the card open, but we didn't want to participate in the interchange because we didn't want any of the exposure for risk or loss.
Right. I would say the short answer to your question, Eric, is yes. There is certainly a distinct trend of smaller banks revisiting their two things, whether they're offering anything through a partner or otherwise, and in the way of a credit card. If they are already offering credit cards through partners, exactly what the terms of those relationships are. The thing that you give up in some of those partnership scenarios is you give up control with what you can do with the credit cards. So the bottom line answer is yes. A lot of banks are revisiting what they're doing with their credit card franchise, how much control or not they have, and if the fear of the risk and the exposure of risk, especially in terms of fraud risk, in that was the reason why you wanted to be at arm's length from it by way of a partner. A lot of revisiting that fear as well, because remember, our fraud liabilities and our fraud exposures are changing right now as well. And in fact, we're going to talk about in just a moment some of the most effective ways now to really minimize and mitigate card fraud that might materially change the pro forma you were looking at that went into convincing you to outsource your credit card relationship in the first place. So the answer is yes to that, an absolute yes to that. That's a great question. And it's strategic. It's strategically really, really important now. Again, as you see more and more card transactions begin to disappear from the physical point of sale, and they're being negotiated, in the background automatically. A lot of those card-on-file systems, the default card are credit cards, not debit cards. That's absolutely the case with iTunes, for example. And if you've actually tokenized, by the way, your cards for participation in Apple Pay, as a user of Apple Pay, the first thing that Apple does when you're setting that up is say, hey, do you want to just default to the card that we have on file in iTunes? And more often than not, that card is a credit card rather than a debit card. A lot don't understand how these defaults really are powerful, can be powerful, either promoters or dissenters of which card gets used in these scenarios that are growing. So great question. All right, so just to move on, so if you look at sort of the shifts going on between this 10-year time period from 2009, for which we have track numbers projected all the way through 2019, cards become even more important. Look at the card share of the payments pie, that orange piece there, going from 35% to 52%. This gets back to Eric's question. Is it important that we actually, A, have a credit card franchise, and B, have more direct control over what we can do with that credit card franchise to ensure that our credit cards have as good a chance as possible at being that card on file default? And the answer to that is yes, if you look strategically at the growth ahead. If we look at regulatory requirements, so same-day ACH is the first phase of it comes online in September of this year. We'll begin with domestic ACH credits. The originating banks of those same-day ACH credits will be paying about 5.2 cents. The receiving banks will be receiving that 5.2 cents. But the really big important thing that you need to know about ACH is that this is also will be a new revenue opportunity. Faster payments will command a premium for certain payment applications. And this is good news. A lot of us have been scratching our heads about, how do we get away from relying on overdraft income so singularly to subsidize our, deposit operations and our account operations. faster payments, and then on the heels of that, real-time payments, as we will see come to the fore in the next 18 months to 2 years, are going to be premium payment services that will command a premium and will generate new revenue streams that banks have not had in the past. And we'll see that. Federal Reserve is already establishing the faster payment criteria. These are 36 criteria that any new real-time payments provider have to pass muster, if you will, to get the blessing of the Federal Reserve. So we have 2 entities right now that are in that vying for that spot in real-time payments. You've got the early warning group on the one hand, and you've got the clearinghouse on the other hand, and it's an all-out sign-up war going on right now to see who can get the greatest number of financial institutions signed on to these real-time payment networks over the next 18 months to 2 years, because, as I mentioned before, in payments it's all about ubiquity. It's all about having most, if not all, financial institutions tied together so that when it comes to moving money from any one entity to any other, everybody's covered because all financial institutions in between those entities are covered. If you look at what's going on over in Europe, and I'm not going to spend any time on this at all, you know, that system, the payment system in Europe, is being fundamentally opened up by way of regulatory mandate to third parties. Third parties are being given direct access to payments on accounts at banks in Europe. I don't think we're going to see that in the United States anytime soon, but I would tell you that over the next 3 to 5 years, paying attention to what happens as a result of that opening up of the payments ecosystem in Europe might certainly get the attention of our regulators in the United States and begin to shape the way they draft regulation for our payments industry going forward.
Got a question for you.
Yep.
So if you go back to that same day ACH and the ability to send money to somebody, and your proposal or suggestion that could maybe warrant a premium where you could maybe generate some fee income off of that, how does that position itself against some of the other more fintech related? You already mentioned PayPal and Venmo, but Facebook Pay to Pay and some of those others where you can go into those platforms and I can pay you right now instantaneously through PayPal, and it's a seamless, easy, transparent process for free. Why or how does a financial institution position that as something that somebody would be willing to pay for when there are other non-bank alternatives that are doing it already at no cost?
Yeah, well, it gets down to the payment application specifically. So, for instance, most of us, when we think about PayPal or we think about Venmo or we think about Square, those are P2P payments. And I would tell you that most of those, like you said, are free right now. The ones that we just mentioned are free, and they will continue to be free. In fact, I would tell you that particular payment application will become table stakes as payments become faster and then ultimately payments become real time. There are other payments applications where a premium, will be not only commanded, but it will be paid. That would be, by the way, instantaneous payroll payments, instantaneous payroll adjustments, real-time expedited bill payments. There's lots of what we call payment applications or payment scenarios in which speed is suddenly at a high premium, and it will command a premium. Now, let me give you some context there. U.S. Bank in the United States is the first to offer a tiered fee schedule for faster payments and real-time payments in the United States. Their faster payments and real-time payments it's not ubiquitous. It doesn't work for all, from U.S. Bank to any and all banks yet, because again, the rails for that don't exist ubiquitously for that yet. But they're coming out of the gate with, I think it's something like a, hey, you can do a regular next day ACH payment for free. If you want it to do same day, that's going to be like, I think it's like $3, $2.99, something like that. If you want it to be real time, it's going to be $5.99, or maybe even north of $6. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to be the fee schedule that everybody else is going to have. That's obviously going to come way down from that. But that's where U.S. Bank is starting, with a fee schedule that, again, commands a fee for the value of getting a payment done sooner rather than later. And you will have some kind of fee schedule, a tiered fee schedule for faster payments, whether it's same day and or near real time or real time, for these specific payment applications where it's really, really important to the originator of the payment that that payment get made now. Will that change the free P2P, mobile P2P trend that we've said and that you're citing, Eric? No, I don't think so. But there's so many different scenarios, applications of payments that you can't just think of one particular scenario and then generalize that from that to all scenarios.
Good. That helps. Okay. Good perspective. Yep.
Okay. So just to let you know where we are with EMV, we've got about, it doesn't feel this way. Eric, I think, said in the intro, 20% of merchants, are actually actively EMV enabled. 50% right now, this is the number, 50% of merchants are now EMV ready. Now, EMV ready and EMV capable may be two different things. It's one thing to have the equipment, it's another for the equipment to be properly configured and in operation. But that EMV readiness number even is not going to reach anything approaching functional saturation until end of 2017. That's the current projection on EMV. And during this transition, we're right in the middle of this EMV transition in the United States. During this transitional window, fraud is concentrating at the last to deploy. That includes small issuers who are the last to chip their cards. That includes small merchants who are going to be the last to update their point of sale infrastructure. And I just want everybody to realize that. So EMV, yes, it's a pain in the butt. The user experience sucks right now, but it has to be done. If you delay and you are on the tail end of adoption and deployment of the chipping of your cards, et cetera, you will see spikes in fraud concentrating on your cards because, by the way, the fraudsters know exactly how to take advantage of that, not only through your unchipped cards, but through those unchipped cards at non-EMV enabled point of sale terminals. And so that brings up fraud, and I want to at least give a, by the way, Eric's going to provide, or Eric, I'm making available through you a handout that's going to have a lot more information than what we're able to cover here within the hour. But I want to get one last thing in here, and we'll open up for some questions and some conversation. But right now, if you only look at what's going on with fraud based on top line losses, you would think that hey, we're doing okay. If you look 2014 to 2015, this is basically overall fraud incidents and overall fraud losses. If you look 2014 to 2015, this is the last year, of course, that we have definitive numbers, it looks like, well, total fraud losses actually came down from 16 to 15 billion, right? And the number of, or percentage of U.S. consumers affected only marginally, went up a little bit from 5.2 to 5.3% of the population. And you would think, well, we're doing pretty good. EMV's doing its job. This is the way it's supposed to work. But I can tell you that those top line numbers mask a really dramatic shift in the type of fraud that is being affected through payments today. And I can't describe this in any more dramatic way than the table I'm showing you now. If you look at what, there's lots of different ways to look at breaches. You can look at how the breach happened, what kinds of companies were actually breached, or what type of record was actually compromised in those breaches. If you look at the latter, what kind of particular information was breached, look at this shift that happens between 2014 and 2015. The number of card records compromised in 2015 went from, in the year prior, 64 million to 0.8 million. And why is that? Because the breaches were so egregious and so large and so widespread in 2014 that the industry clamped down. Even individual cardholders became a little bit more selective about how and when they used their cards, right? And look at that, look at what it came down from 64 million to 0.8 million. That's the good news. The bad news is that in terms of Social Security numbers that were compromised, we went from 16 million being compromised in 2014 to 164 million Social Security numbers being compromised last year. Ladies and gentlemen, there are only 320 million of us in the United States. That means that half of all Social Security numbers, for practical purposes, were compromised last year. That means we can no longer use Social Security numbers in any context, in any way, as unique identifiers or authenticators of anybody, but including and especially in payments applications. Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit more. What does that mean? That means that because of all of those Social Security numbers that went out into the dark corners of the dark web, new account fraud doubled in 2015, right? So whereas we had been talking about counterfeit card fraud and breaches at the point of sale and all this kind of stuff, the new thing, right, and we've seen this continue through 2016, is new account fraud, where those compromised Social Security numbers are being used to establish accounts in your name without you knowing about it in any number of different settings. And that's the big concern, not only coming into 2016, but even rolling in to 2017. So here's what I want you to take away. Here's something important to take away from our talk today. Look at our response to this, the shift. As we shift from point-of-sale counterfeit card fraud to card-not-present fraud in the e-commerce, online, in-app settings, something really interesting is happening. First, issuers are tightening their authorization criteria for card transactions in general, but especially in card-not-present environments. Okay, and typically, by the way, the average bank issuer is just defaulting to whatever the new tighter authorization criteria is with their issuer processor, right? And when that happens, what's happening is because those authorization criteria are being tightened, we're generating more declines. And by way of that, we're generating more false declines specifically. So let me tell you why that matters. That matters because when you decline someone falsely, right, you get red flag criteria have been met, and suddenly those criteria affect a decline at the point of sale. Let's say it's one of your best customers. Well, what happens? Well, they now have a user experience that tells them, I can't rely on my bank's card to work when I'm at a point of sale. Not only that, I am going to experience a micro humiliation at the point of sale by slowing this line down. By the way, micro humiliation shapes more of payments than any of us even have any idea that it does. We could do a day on that, Eric. Maybe we'll do another session on that. But here's the bottom line. Your losses from those improperly declined transactions outpace your actual fraud liability in any given year 4-to-1. That's from MasterCard. That's not from me. That's from MasterCard. Why is that? It's because when you falsely decline one of your cardholders, 40% of those declined cardholders abandon your cards, either literally or just functionally and behaviorally. An additional 25% on top of that 40% reduce their card usage somewhere between 11 and 15% usually. All right, and that drop in usage lasts for at least 6 months. At least that's as long as we've done research to track it, or MasterCard has done research to track it. It usually lasts longer than that. I had this experience myself recently. I have a long-standing relationship with the community bank here locally. We live in South Georgia. We took a day trip down to Tallahassee, Florida. They have a Whole Foods in Tallahassee. We don't have one where we live. So we went to the Whole Foods. As Eric knows, we spent $400 at Whole Foods, as you do when you go to Whole Foods. And at checkout, I was going to use Apple Pay. They accept Apple Pay there. I had my community bank's debit card on file as the default card in Apple Pay, and I got declined. Why did I get declined? I got declined because A, I was out of state. B, I was shopping at a place I normally don't ever shop at. C, it was for a high dollar amount. And those three criteria triggered in their auto authorization rules a false decline. Now, I don't want to be humiliated. Unfortunately, this is Apple Pay, so what did I do? I took my thumb and I dragged my Amex card to the top of my Apple Pay application, and I did the Apple Pay transaction on my Amex card. And ladies and gentlemen, that's the card that remains my default top of card in my Apple Pay wallet. What does that mean? That means my my community bank's debit card is not getting the transactions through Apple Pay that it used to, and therefore my community bank's not getting the interchange that it used to. These things really matter, and they're happening in aggregate on scales that most banks and most bank issuers specifically don't appreciate. And this is the price of bad user experience in payments. In fact, let me give you this number. So we had $9 billion worth of actual card fraud in the United States last year. But if you look at the total dollar amount of transactions we falsely declined as issuers last year, that number is 118 billion. Ladies and gentlemen, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. We are actually costing ourselves more in trying to fight fraud than the fraud itself is costing us as an industry. Okay? So we are falsely declining 13 times more in dollar amount than we are actually eating in actual fraud on a year-in, year-out basis. All right. So, Eric, I've got all kinds of other things to talk about. We didn't get to blockchain and some of the other cool, fancy stuff. Maybe we can pick that up on another call. But do we have any questions that came through? Anything we want to talk about here before we finish up our hour?
So as a reminder, if you've got a question or a comment, go ahead and use the questions and answers function in your control panel and shoot it over. While we're waiting, one of the things, and it's part of the title, maybe kind of give a high level as to what is it that Starbucks is doing that causes them to rock. And maybe it's not Starbucks, maybe it's organizations like Starbucks, but are they kind of creating their own path? Are they building their own infrastructure? What is it that makes Starbucks and others like them really the rock stars of payment, and why should banks be concerned or paying attention?
Yeah, so here's what's, and I apologize, I put way too much information here in the handout to get to live. So Starbucks, for those of you, there's a precious few of you on this call who knows that Starbucks introduced in the middle of last year a new feature function in their Starbucks app called Mobile Order Ahead and Pay. And what this allows you to do is just that. You can order ahead and you don't have to stand in line anymore. They took away the physical instance of a payment inside of the store. So you order, and most people order the same thing at Starbucks over and over and over again. So once you've ordered that once, I mean, ordering something at Starbucks, you basically go, yes, I want to order that again with one thumb hit. If you need to top up your virtual Starbucks prepaid mechanism that stands behind the app, you do that with a thumbprint. You can use Apple Pay, by the way, to do those top-ups. The point is that you're no longer physically standing in line. The biggest hassle in payments is not making the payment. It's not even the difference between swiping versus dipping versus waving versus tapping. It's having to stand in line waiting to do a physical instance of a payment. So the really prophetic thing about Starbucks Mobile Order Ahead and Pay is that you don't stand in line anymore. You literally walk in the store, you go to the corner, and you'll see your drink either sitting there or you will see it sitting back a little bit, and you'll say, hey, I'm here to pick up my mobile order. And they give it to you, and you walk out of the store. I timed this once. I walked into a Starbucks. The first time I did this, I walked into a Starbucks. I was behind 5 people in line, and I suddenly remembered there was this new feature to test. And so while I was in line, I ordered my drink, and I stepped out of line. 2 minutes later, literally 2 minutes later, by the way, it's real time. So as soon as you submit your order, it prints out there behind the countertop. And as soon as it prints out, that's the next thing that the barista makes. No matter what, that's the next thing that he or she makes. And so it was ready in 2 minutes. I picked up my drink. I looked back. There were still 3 people in the line. So this is another instance of what's called the sublimation of payments, the disappearance of payments, physical instances of payments. The other is buy online, pick up in store. 10% of all things purchased at Target.com are bought ahead of time and then picked up physically at the local store later. And that's the biggest, the fastest growing trend in retail payments right now. What that means for all of us is whereas we're thinking about what can we do in terms of mobile wallets, should we tokenize our cards to participate in Apple Pay or Samsung Pay and Android Pay, as we're really thinking about all of those sort of nearer term questions and challenges, what's going on on a longer term scale is that payments are beginning to disappear physically from the point of sale. And when you look at it that way, we now have less control over an input over which form of payment or which particular card is used to be able to make that payment. Rather, it's whatever card is on file for Starbucks, for Target, for Walmart. By the way, we now have Walmart Pay. That's another example of the same thing. And so we have to suddenly get really intentional and conspicuous with how we reward or incent our own cardholders to use our particular cards as the top of wallet defaults in those card on file systems. And that sublimation of payments is something that a lot of bank issuers are not yet thinking about at the moment. And so that's the longer term sort of strategic importance of where things are headed with payments. Now, I'm not saying that all payments are going to suddenly sublimate over the next 2 years, not anything near that. But these trends are really important because as we go from, and I didn't define this, but contextual commerce 2.0 is doing payments that are contextually aware. So if you think mobile order ahead and pay actually are, it's good examples of that. But not only that, as we go to contextual commerce 3.0, contextual commerce 2.0 is understanding when you have not just the interest to buy, but the intent to buy. Finding those places in online settings, in-app settings, combined geolocation-wise with physical settings, where you've got both an interest and an intent to buy, and you can make that payment happen in faster, better ways. Contextual commerce 2.0 is when we combine not just the interest and intent to buy, but also the ability to buy. That is, okay, yes, I'm interested in buying. I want to buy this thing, but you know what? I don't know whether I should buy it or not because I don't know if I have enough money to buy it or not. And that's when, and this you will see, 3.0 is, we'll really see that in about 3 to 5 years out. But I can tell you it's conspicuously important to Gen Y to know that they've got enough money to buy something before they buy something. And that's all we talk about anymore, right, is Generation Y, the millennials, how we're going to attract them, how we're going to retain them, how we're going to tap that asset transfer from the baby boomers to Gen Y. I can tell you Gen Y's biggest concerns right now financially are how do I pay off my student debt? How do I prevent myself from spending too much so that I can begin to save some and hopefully enough to eventually make a down payment on a house? Those are the things that Gen Y is concerned about. And those are the things that we have to begin helping Gen Y with in real time, not just by way of payments, but also by way of all the things we're doing with mobile banking to take them out of fear and into some kind of assurance and peace. And that's good news for bank issuers and the midterm, 3 to 5 years.
Cool. Good. Before, and Lee, if you've got a few more minutes, I know we're at the top of the hour. I want to just make a couple of quick announcements in case people have to drop off. But if you've got a little bit more time, we've got at least one more question in the queue. If you've got a few more minutes. Okay.
Absolutely, yeah.
For those of you that do have to drop off, we will be making the full recording available at the Powered by WSI/BES or the Banker Education Series page. So you can come back and view it there. And if you are interested in getting a copy of the handouts that Lee has referred to, you can go to the Powered by WSI site and go to the Contact Us and send that to me. I will get your email or just respond to the notification for the webinar, and I'll make sure that we get you the slide deck. So that's for those of you that do have to leave and have a hard stop, I want to make sure that they know that. One observation on that, there's a gentleman out there, his name is Gary Vaynerchuk. Gary V, he goes by, kind of gained the fame of building his family's wine business and using social media to take it way, way over the top.
Yeah.
He comments a lot on Uber, for example, and one of the things that he mentions, and it kind of parlays into your Starbucks example, is Uber doesn't sell transportation. What they actually do is they sell convenience. You're not buying coffee with the Starbucks app. You're buying time because you skipped in front of those 3 people and you were in and out of that store much faster than anybody else. And that's where I think community banks need to figure out how they can help save their customers time because that's the precious scarcity that everybody is trying to fight, in addition to the other elements that you mentioned for the Gen Y millennials. But, thinking of that as a mentality, I get in the car, I get out of the car, it's seamless and frictionless. And so thinking of things that way. So
that's exactly right. And not only you're spot on with that. Uber might be actually the best example of sublimation of payments. But think about it. It's not just that it's removing the physical instance of the payment in Uber. It's also removing that awkward moment of tension where you would otherwise have to also, in addition to pay the taxi driver, you would have to figure out what you're going to tip the taxi driver. There's no tipping in Uber. That's the other thing that a lot of people don't realize who maybe haven't tried their first Uber ride yet, is the payment. You just get in the car, you take the ride, you get out of the car. It is as frictionless as it can be, and I certainly prefer Uber to taxi rides personally because of that very thing. That's exactly right.
So, the next question might be positioned a little bit as a promo for Jack Henry, but hey, it is what it is, and I will let you answer accordingly. You mentioned Android Pay being able to be incorporated into the mobile banking app. Wondering if Jack Henry is working on this for Godot, Banno Mobile, other sorts of payment. Is that something that you, as one of the largest data processing providers for community banks out there, are looking at? Because I know that is one thing when I talk to banks, they say, yeah, this is all great, but Jack Henry doesn't do that. Fiserv doesn't do that. FIS doesn't do that. And we don't have the deep wallet like a Bank of America or a U.S. bank where we can build our own. We're somewhat held hostage to the abilities and the interest of these core processors to allow us as a community bank to be able to do this.
Yeah, so there's two, that's a great question. And there are two components to the answer. One is, and I don't want to, I'm actually not a product person at Jack Henry, but I know that our payments, our Jack Henry Payment Solutions division, what we call our Card Processing Solutions group, they are actively able to, or equipping to be able to tokenize and facilitate the tokenization of cards for Android Pay specifically. So that's component number one. Component number two is the larger issue of how can we do anything. It's not just a matter of just integrating a mobile payment capability. It gets back to what we talked about at the front end, which is how can we just do things, any number of things that may crop up from a third party, and that's where the platform becomes really, really important. So at Jack Henry, again, this is, and I'm not, by the way, I'm not a sales guy either, and I'm not on commission of any kind, and I'm not a product person. But what I can tell you strategically, from Jack Henry's standpoint, is that we see it this way. We see that a platform that enables flexibility for banks, whether it's with their mobile banking app or anything they do digitally, is absolutely vital going forward. So it doesn't just tie into things like in my world outside, being able to tie in things like Android Pay from outside of the Jack Henry universe. It also goes to being able to simplify what's inside of our own universe as well. So I'll give you an example. Jack Henry, offers 300 different products and solutions. Well, my gosh, that's a lot. And by the way, if you look at FIS, if you look at Fiserv, they offer, orders of magnitude, even more products and services than that. That's not really practical for any given bank to have to navigate that many different products and solutions and spot solutions, as we would call them. So going forward, we've got to do two things by way of these platforms. First of all, we've got to really simplify the existing feature functionality that we offer across all of these different spot solutions that are already in place, so that it's easy to pick, choose, curate, and put together coherent end-user experiences. But the platform that does that also needs to be the same platform that can enable that bank to tie in an Android Pay API and to tie in, an API from, fintech provider, whoever, who's just done this really, really one thing really, really well, and we want to incorporate that in to what we're doing with our mobile banking app. And so in the Jack Henry world, our Banno platform is that. We were one of the first, I think we were the first big financial technology service provider to come up with a platform for opening up our systems to integrations on the outside, and that was called J Exchange. Now we have, in addition to J Exchange, we have the Banno platform. So I say all of that again. That's not a plug. I'm just letting you know strategically that at Jack Henry we recognize the absolute importance of being able to be as flexible and open as possible going forward. But to functionally make that happen, you have to have a platform that facilitates one-to-many API integrations rather than having to put the onus on the bank to negotiate those one by one with every single fintech, outside partner, payments partner, whatever the case may be that crops up over the course of the bank's existence. So hopefully I answered your question, but I certainly hear that question, and I understand where it's coming from, and it's a good one.
Yeah, and like I said, I get that all the time. Yeah, so it's got to be done. So,
no.
Well, I think we're out of time, but the good news is we can just split your deck in half, and we'll do that for another episode down the road, because we've got kind of the additional items you talked about kind of towards the end, the Negativa topic, and then we didn't get to Bitcoin and blockchain and some of those things. And like I said, when we were talking, there was even other topics that didn't even make it into this deck that I think would be really great ones for our audience to hear. So if you are game, I am as well, and it just gives me another opportunity to enjoy a conversation with you for at least an hour, maybe more. And it doesn't
absolutely
enough. So
absolutely,
cool.
Eric. Thank you.
Good. Well, let's go ahead and we will put a bow on this episode of Banker Education Series. I want to thank Lee Wetherington for his time today. This has certainly been an awesome show, and you've shared some tremendously helpful and informational statistics and other sorts of data to help our community banks kind of understand payments a little bit better and gain some, some reality and some perspective on what's going on out there. So thank you again for your time today, and we'll look forward to having you back in the future. So with that, if you have not done so, again, powered by WSI/BES is a shortcut to the Banker Education Series page. You can go ahead and subscribe to the email list for future show announcements, and when the show is done and compiled and uploaded to YouTube and all that other fancy stuff, we'll go ahead and we'll provide a link to that show, to this show on that page, so you can go ahead and watch it again or share it with friends and coworkers. But until next month, thanks for joining me here on the Banker Education Series webinar show. We'll look forward to hopefully seeing you in July. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.